Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to the seventh technical session. The speaker for this is Professor Anki Mukherjee. She is a professor of English and World Literatures at the University of Oxford and a fellow of Wadham College. She is the author of Aesthetic Hysteria, which was published in 2007, and What is a Classic? Post-Colonial Rewriting and Invention of the Canon, published in 2014, which won the British Academy Prize for English Literature in 2015. She is the editor of two collections of essays on literature and psychoanalysis and has published articles on Victorian literature and culture, post-colonial studies, and intellectual history in peer-reviewed journals such as PMLA, MLQ, Contemporary Literature, and others. The chair for this technical session is Professor Purushottam Vilimoria. He is a professor of philosophy and comparative studies at Deakin University in Australia and senior research fellow in the University of Melbourne. He's a visiting professor and lecturer at University of California, Berkeley, and Dominican University, San Anselmo, and Shiv Dasani Fellow of Oxford University. His areas of specialist research and publications cover classical Indian philosophy and comparative ethics, continental thought, cross-cultural philosophy of religion, diaspora studies, bioethics, and personal law in India. He's an editor-in-chief of Sophia, Journal of Philosophy of Religion, Springer. He also works on political philosophy pertaining to ethics of right, theories of justice, capabilities, education, and gender issues in Third World, particularly South Asian context. Thank you, sir and ma'am. Over to you.
So shall I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, thank you so much, Shikha, for that introduction. Thank you, very many thanks to Dr. Om Dwivedi for the kind invitation. And hello, Professor Vilimoria. Pre-coronavirus world was more bust than boom for higher education in the UK. We were confronting a deepening crisis in the humanities, by which I mean three specific and related phenomena: shrinking resources to support humanities programs, and growing skepticism or anxiety about their worth. Secondly, budget cuts, defunding, the corporatization of higher education, the creation of a precariat, and finally, shifting ideas of higher education as a means of credentializing, not an end in itself. In 2010, Wayne Bivens Statham, the philosophy and religion librarian at Princeton University, searched crisis in the humanities on JSTOR and found articles dating from the 1920s. So even the particular lineaments of this debate, crisis in the humanities, are not new. In the 2010s, before Corona that is, we weren't simply rehashing the dodgy argument that humanities education is art for art's sake, but passionately outlining the practical utility and efficacy of teaching, studying, and practicing the humanities. Just like humanism, which sought to secure human rights, justice, and power for the citizen subject, the humanities, we argued, about power, justice, human rights, equality, the queering and decolonizing of time and place, and the future of humankind in the Anthropocene. Speaking of English studies in particular, Bruce Robbins pointed out that there is an unexpected resonance between indigenous cultures struggling to survive and what might be called the cultural survivalism of departments of literature. I quote this section from his Boundary Through article, Time and Politics in the Humanities and Human Rights, more fully to sound the cautionary note in Bruce Robbins' stance here. Literary criticism made room for itself in a crowded and competitive field of disciplines by selling to the public a legitimizing narrative in which the necessary and desirable publicness of culture, capital C, which was in imminent danger of being overrun by the churlish culture substitutes mass-produced by the culture industry, could only be preserved by a new branch of expertise devoted to its redemption. So this salvage model, and the phrase is James Clifford's, this salvage model, the repeated rescue of culture or cultures imagined as on the brink of extinction, and the auto-salvage model of the humanities rescuing itself, has done much to legitimize the discipline in the pre-coronavirus world. Let us not claim with impunity, however, that there is a direct line from humanities to social justice pre or post-COVID. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak points out that when artists and philosophers call for social justice, they are acting as responsible citizens of the world, themselves perhaps changed by practicing art and philosophy, sometimes using the weight of their prestige as artists and philosophers to make an appeal. Quoting Daniel Barenboim, she offers a practical form of social justice. It is absolutely essential, she says, for people to get to know the other, to understand what the other thinks and feels, so that the two sides can disagree and not resort to knives. Let me introduce a personal note here. I have been revising during what was meant to be our Easter vacation here at the University of Oxford, the manuscript of a book I'm about to submit to the press, titled Unseen City, The Psychic Life of Poverty in Mumbai, London, and New York. It examines the institution of Freudian psychoanalysis in its inadequate engagements with urban poverty, race, and migrancy, as seen in the specific context of global cities, London, New York, and Mumbai predominantly, but also Kolkata, Bengaluru, and Chennai. I examine literary and aesthetic representations of poverty in relation to each city's psychiatric culture, especially as that culture is manifested in public policy and attitudes toward mental health needs of the poor. Involving nearly a decade's work with public sector mental hospitals, NGOs, and psychoanalytic clinics in 3 continents, this book is meant to be the very opposite of top-down philanthropy. Exposing the entrenched contexts of mental illness through barefoot research and narrative, observational, as well as quantitative data, it urges the inclusion of humanities in current debates on poverty and public mental health. 3 weeks into the lockdown in the UK, so around April 11th, Food Foundation said that 1.5 million people in Britain had reported not eating for a whole day because they had no money or access to food. 3 million people in total were in households where some members had been forced to skip some meals. News reports confirmed that more than 1 million people had reported losing all their income during the pandemic, with over a third believing there would be no government aid. So this was the city invisible, the unseen city of my book title. And by the way, this phrase, city visible but unseen, is borrowed from the central section of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, where he talks about the migrant ghettos of London. Growing inequality and hunger on one side of the class apartheid, the suburban consolations of green onion gardening, sourdough starters, and Tai Chi on the other. The food banks in North Oxford, where I live, were all closed due to food shortages during this period. And with some research, I could find only one charity which was actively contributing to food distribution for those at risk. A report published by the Guardian newspaper yesterday confirmed what we knew already, that residents in deprived areas have experienced double the death rates of those in affluent areas, as new figures from the Office for National Statistics reveal. Of the 20,283 COVID-19 registered deaths in England and Wales up to the 17th of April, an overwhelming proportion of fatalities were of people from the poorest areas. The most deprived areas had 55.1 deaths per 100,000 people, more than double that of people in the least deprived areas, where the death rate was 25.3, according to figures from England and Wales published by the Office for National Statistics. So, while the death in deadline has become all too literal for any author in this time, and I'm writing furiously every day, I'm increasingly unnerved about what the interpretive humanities can't see And what they will no longer be able to see as the R word, recession, becomes the D word, depression, a depression that lasts several years. I think about the subjects of my third monograph, doubly colonized by poverty and mental illness, in whose struggles I have seen great resilience and even happiness, not only wretchedness. I worry about the changing fortunes of universities, the humanities, English studies, and most importantly, our present and future students. There is a hiring freeze in universities on both sides of the pond. There are whispers of pay cuts and job losses. No foreign students without international travel. The Economist reported yesterday that foreign students contributed a fifth of the income of 48 higher education institutions in Britain. Most hard hit in this industry in crisis are the precarious workers, the non-tenured and adjunct faculty, the graduates teaching assistants. In a recent article, Stefan Collini, who's a Cambridge professor but also a public intellectual, he shared data which showed that 54% of university staff are employed on some form of insecure contract, most of them women, making them cheaper and also more expendable. In many UK universities, up to a third of their teaching is delivered by such precarious staff. And 46% of universities, Collini writes, use zero-hour contracts to deliver teaching. With universities going remote from March this year, the rights of these casual workers have not been ring-fenced, far from it. In fact, there are reports of staff being laid off, contracts not being renewed, as there is less teaching to be done in a non-residential university, and with much of the content shifting online. As Charles Dickens frequently pointed out about authorship in his industrial age, writing is a peculiar, precarious, and an all-encompassing vocation. His too was an era when productivity was valued as much as the product. And in resistance to its consumerist attitudes, Dickens wrote incomplete novels that signaled the inadequacy of closure. Inadequacy not in the old-fashioned sense of failure or the new-fashioned sense of the art of failure. It is inadequacy as the novel's work ethic, D.A. Miller explains in his wonderful scholarship on Charles Dickens's Bleak House. It's inadequacy as the novel's, and I quote Miller here, imposing refusal of rest. As academics, now is the time to ground our research and writing in the needs of our time and our world, if we haven't already done so, while also fighting for realms of thought and theory that are untimely and unworldly, utopian or inadequate. This really is no time to rest. Could writing, like our lives depended on it, this is a phrase from Charles Dickens himself, could this brush with species and institutional death help us live more in the post-coronavirus world? I ask. I was teaching my first-year undergraduates T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland last week. We met on Zoom in one of the last days of April 2020 to read a poem that is about unreal cities and that begins with April is the cruelest month. Eliot's poem was published after the outbreak of the Spanish flu, and he himself had caught it in December 1918. He did not write the epochal poem in the middle of the global pandemic in the sense that he started writing it about 10 years before its publication. But he was no doubt thinking, as Paul Valery did in 1919, that civilizations were mortal. In the decade or so, so the poem was published in 1921, in the decade or so that when he drafted the poem, a world war had ripped through Europe where Eliot lived. His wife Vivian had had a nervous breakdown. Eliot himself, his mental health deteriorating, had been asked by a nerve specialist to go away from London, which he did. He went to Margate first, followed by a sanatorium in Lausanne. On this enforced quarantine, he finished The Wasteland. This long poem is replete with examples of missed opportunities to live life more fully, with more pulsating aliveness. In the hyacinth garden in section 1, you were there, your arms full and your hair wet, yet I could not speak, my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light, the silence. Surely Eliot knew Strindberg's The Ghost Sonata, published and performed in 1907. Critics have speculated over the years. The student of Strindberg's play falls for a girl watering hyacinths in her window box. The girl is talking to hyacinths, and she's described in the play as a hyacinth herself. In the final scene of the play, meeting in a room full of hyacinths, the student says he has loved this flower because it embodies everything I lack. Yet the perfume of the hyacinth, he says, confuses my senses, deafens me, blinds me, drives me from my room, shoots me with poisoned arrows. Caught up in ideology-laden epistemologies of the senses, the student loses all common sense and finally immediate sensation. His beloved, the hyacinth girl, is killed, and he himself is rendered soulless, one of the living dead. In the wasteland, too, the sensory overload of the hyacinth girl is met with muteness and a hysterical blindness. Whether language is too much for this moment or not enough, we will not know, as the poem trains our eyes to the blinding heart of light and the resounding silence. My student spoke movingly about the loss of connection, the loss of the ability to connect, the missed encounters they detected in the poem. On Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing, T.S. Eliot writes in section 3 of The Wasteland. He was in Margate in October and November 1921 on his rest cure when he drafted this part of the poem. Note that he doesn't say, I can't connect anything to anything. I mean, this is a less poetic line, but it's also a very different sentiment from saying, on Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. The Wasteland is living proof that Kandoism can work in times of global pandemic. The Wasteland is living proof that connecting nothing with nothing is a museumizing of something. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mukherjee. It was very rich and nuanced talk, very much
Thank
appreciated. You're hearing elements of philosophy in it as well. And the discussions about the plight of humanities, obviously. Humanities in the university, in the academy, has always been regarded as something of a bastard child, to use Salman Rushdie's term in other contexts. It's never a practical discipline, no heavily theoretical, perhaps in the way that social sciences, with this sort of more experimental base, or the natural sciences would be considered to be. And then, of course, within that, certain disciplines can almost fall away, for irrelevance. Philosophy being one, and perhaps I'm not sure about your discipline, English and literature and so on. But even in a place like UC Berkeley, where humanities tends to be very strong, is under attack. There's a lot of sort of budget cutbacks and so forth, which invariably affect the humanities, wherever, in Melbourne University as well. One of the first faculties that bear the brunt of cutbacks is the humanities. I don't know whether it's because of the sort of element of humanism in it, or because of sort of perceived irrelevance to the world. And I think the world is the world of corporatism, of capitalism, of greed, of money, and we don't speak that language. I think it's very hard to sort of make those sort of connections and criticisms. I mean, with all due respect to Eliot, and I love that, making connection of nothing to nothing as a philosopher. I write on nothingness myself, and I'm really, really grateful for that line. Those are sort of things that don't make any sense to the people out there, to the rest of the world. What is this? I mean, I wrote a paper on why is there nothing rather than something, subverting Leibniz. And everybody tried to correct me. He said, no, the real question is why is there something rather than nothing? Nobody could have a clue. But that Heidegger was the one who had actually asked the question that I reframed. So no, coming back to them, I'm really would like to applaud your advocacy that humanities needs to go out and be more practically more engaged, literally engaged as well. We have economic crisis, we have climate change crisis, now we have the COVID crisis, and if we don't engage with the world and stay in our ivory towers, I think we lose the plot. And so this is very, 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 very important. I mean, philosophers do their little bit as well, but it's good to see people in literature coming out with it as well, and you have the resources for that too. Very rich material, Dickens and other Eliot and other people who you cite. So with that, I express gratitude on behalf of the conference for your wonderful discourse here. So perhaps we should open up for questions now.
Thank you, Professor Billy Maria.
So it's a pleasure to hear you. Any questions from the participants or the audience? I guess if there are questions, someone was writing something while you were talking, and I can't see it now. Does anybody see a question? There was a question for, yeah, okay. I guess it's for you, although they seem to have misspelled your name maybe. In your manuscript that you shared, all cities are very different in their demographic dividend. I guess they mean Mumbai, London, and New York, if not also Bangalore and Chennai. They seem to be different in the demographic dividend. Micro, or I guess may mean micro, and macro environments. Please share the similarities and differences that you found and choose this for your research study. Okay, so.
I can answer that.
Sure.
I mean, I will have a few minutes to talk about a 100,000-word manuscript, but to just say that one thing that was unifying these different cities was a phenomenon, a very late phenomenon in kind of the history of Freudian psychoanalysis while Freud was alive, which is called the free clinic phenomenon, where in 1918, he declared that everyone has the right to psychoanalysis, that it's not this kind of, it's not meant to be this commodified bourgeois thing, but that, psychoanalysts would have to devote a part of every week, if not every day, toward dispensing psychoanalysis for free. So, and this movement, or these kind of democratic socialist ideologies had moved to India when psychoanalysis first arrived there in the 1920s. Yeah. So at first the cities were connected because I was trying to look at where the free clinic movement had gone and what that moment of social democratic psychoanalysis, what that looked like in an international frame. And then I found that there's very, very little by way of non-pharmaceutical interventions into mental health, into the maladies of poor populations. And I literally went where I could. And I have, kind of in a way written about NGO work, about kind of, almost vigilante work by kind of psychiatrists and psychoanalysts, where they are offering this kind of psychotherapeutic assistance to people who are also suffering the ravages of poverty. So the cities are extremely different, but when you read my book, you will see see that the provision for the homeless guy in Harlem is uncannily similar to the provision for, you know, kind of the somebody with psychosocial disability in Kolkata. So the equalizing factor is that these maladies are visible but largely unseen when it comes to mental health policy of states, of governments, of kind of even sort of, you know, the kind of like the blind spots of NGOs. So the short answer is that I was following one phenomenon, which is the free clinic phenomenon, and I went to the cities where there were Freudian psychoanalysts who were also offering services to poor populations.
May I add? You know, Foucault was, of course, very critical of institutionalized psychiatry, and of course, R.D. Laing and Thomas Sargent, people did try to open up psychiatry to more or greater access in the public, but of course, perhaps never really took off. At least in psychiatry, didn't take off. And in a city like Bangalore, where you have similar issues, and you get a major institution like Nimhans, but really doesn't really offer that much of, you know, free. I mean, they do have an op-ed section and so forth, but it still is pretty tight, I think, or at least the kind of psychiatry they offer is so heavily biological.
So if I can just qualify that, Foucault was very critical of psychoanalysis, but he also said that there was something in psychoanalysis that made it not anthropology, which is transference. You know, the process of transference in the psychoanalytic session, where the analyst was as impacted as the analysand. And so psychoanalysis was redeemed from the other ethnological sciences by offering that kind of contamination between the masterful subject and the so-called patient. And that's one of the things I'm trying to pursue in the book, that why do we think that the poor are unanalyzable, which is a term that's frequently used? Why do we think that their minds cannot sustain, you know, analysis? And also I'm looking at, you know, how psychoanalysis has to be translated and transfigured when, you know, a kind of psychiatrist in Bangalore is treating somebody who has come from a village and doesn't have the bus fare to come to Bangalore more than 3 times, you know. Right. So I'm looking at the ways in which psychoanalysis will have to be, you know, has to undergo a sea change in order to cater to these publics. But I'm looking at also that model of psychoanalysis as offering transference, where it's kind of like, it's talking shop, it's a talking cure, and we cannot possibly, you know, do poverty alleviation if we think the poor don't have minds that can sustain talk, you know.
But it's all by the same token, though, we're also making the poor a subject in this, or a victim. How do we get out of that kind of a binary that's still created?
So that's a really good question, because not all the poor, and that's one of the very, very curious things when you look at PTSD statistics, that in a group where everyone has been subjected to the same kinds of socioeconomic deprivation, not everyone displays symptoms of mental illness. So no, we're not, I am in fact not like applying the group appellation at all. I'm trying to bring out the singularity of these lives that have suffered these depredations, you know.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Angedi. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
It was wonderful.